Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-rays here and, of course, 4Ks, and that is the topic of conversation for this episode. And I will be talking about 3 recent 4Ks from the Criterion collection. I do apologize. This video is being recorded while the latest Criterion Flash sale is on, but I won't be able to post it until afterwards, so I am sorry about that. These are all recommended for pickup during a flash sale or during a Barnes & Noble sale, whenever that may be. But let's get into this. Let's talk about the new 4K of Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Now, this is... I don't know what number. I think this is the first 4K that Altman's getting in the collection, but his presence there is certainly felt quite strongly in that he has a bunch of other movies that have come out through the Criterion collection, including Three Women, which is one of my favorites of his, The Player, Shortcuts, Nashville, and I guess that one's out of print at this point. And then on the DVD side, they have put out Secret Honor, which is another favorite of mine, a one-man show with Philip Baker Hall. Really interesting. I don't think that's gotten a Blu-ray upgrade anywhere. I'm not 100% sure about that. I got to look now. And Tanner 88, his TV show, that was really interesting too. Anyway, so McCabe and Mrs. Miller, definitely one of his better efforts. It has been called an anti-Western. I think he wanted to sort of tilt the Western genre on its ear. It's in the Northwest, so it's sort of a Northwestern. But I think it's like the first film Altman did with like big stars, meaning like Warren Beatty and Julie Christie. He had done other films that sort of made stars out of the cast, like MASH, and Brewster McCloud precedes this one, and that's got Shelley Duvall and it's Bud Cort and of course Michael Murphy, but Stacy Keach, but it's not like a star movie, and this definitely feels more like that. And well, how do they describe The Unorthodox Dream Western by Robert Altman may be the most radically beautiful film to come out of the new American cinema. It stars Warren Beatty and Julie Christie as 2 newcomers to the raw Pacific Northwest mining town of Presbyterian Church, who's joined forces to provide the miners with a superior kind of whorehouse experience. The appearance of representatives for a powerful mining company with interests of its own, however, threatens to be the undoing of their plans. With its fascinating, flawed characters, evocative cinematography by the great Vilmos Zsigmond, innovative overlapping dialogue, and haunting use of Leonard Cohen songs, McCabe and Mrs. Miller brilliantly deglamorized and revitalized the most American of genres. That's well said. And it's a 2:4:0:1 widescreen, like super widescreen. Transfer looks really nice. And yeah, anytime you can get Vilmos Zsigmond cinematography in Blu-ray or 4K, it is always a plus, because the man was a true artist, beyond reproach. Just really, really excellent craftsman. And I do love the idea that Beatty plays this guy, and he really nails this character. And he may have even been involved in directing some of the movie himself, because he was in the mode of doing that right around this time and was just a huge star. But he really nails it, and he and Julie Christie are really great together. There's a great scene where she arrives in town because she's heard that he's doing this whorehouse thing, and she avails herself to him and tries to make a deal and just says, look, do you know how to handle this kind of thing? What do you do, for this situation and this situation? And she has all these things that he has clearly not thought of, that she's dealt with because she's been in this business for a long time. And so it's clear that they're going to be having this partnership, but there is the sort of dread of what will the mining company do? How far will they go? And, it's never, mining companies in movies, never really a good thing. Never really have too much in the way of helpfulness, always doing something bad. But it is a really interesting Western vibe, and you have Altman's, cast regulars like Renee Auberjonois and Keith Carradine and John Schuck. There's a bunch more of folks that you recognize from his other films. I love that he had that sense of how important a stock company is, and that he would bring a lot of those folks along with him, and just generally caravan some of his movies. Like, this is shot on location, and I'm sure that's in part so that he could get away from the studios and be left alone, but also I think he just really enjoyed the idea of building a community literally and figuratively, and you can kind of feel that in this movie. But it's a really great Warren Beatty performance and great Julie Christie performance for sure. This includes, let's see here, an essay by novelist and critic Nathaniel Rich, and of course you have your 4K and your Blu-ray. The 4K, I'll go into the features, but there's most of them are on the Blu-ray. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, I always like to just sort of check out and sample the essay. So this is Nathaniel Rich's essay called Showdowns. After the startling success of MASH, a war movie without war, Robert Altman set out to make what he called a Western that wasn't a Western. In MASH, in 1970, the filmmaker had gleefully disposed of the genre conventions, the battle scenes, the grim heroism, the appeals to patriotic pride, and he intended to do the same with his adaptation of McCabe, Edmund Naughton's 1959 novel about an internet gambler who tries to defend a small town from the predations of a powerful mining company. The best way to demolish the old cliches, Altman decided, was to use as his source material a novel that embraced them without irony. I picked the story because it's the conventional thing, he said in his 1971 interview. It's the most ordinary, common Western that's ever been told. It's every event, every character, every Western you've ever seen. Altman may have been overstating the case. McCabe is just as odd and bumbling in the novel, which a New York Times reviewer called a distinctly unusual bit of Western realism. Even so, the defiance Altman brought to his, quote, anti-Western was radical enough to derange Hollywood, his Hollywood studio bosses. To them, McCabe and Mrs. Miller was not merely an anti-Western, it was an anti-rational, anti-audience, anti-film. Well said. And it did take a minute to catch on. It was not immediately successful. The opening reviews were not great, and that's actually sort of dealt with in the features here. I'll skip ahead to one of them, which is it includes some Dick Cavett show appearances. So there's two in the features, and one is from July 6, 1971, and it features legendary film critic Pauline Kael herself as a guest on Dick Cavett's show. And she is in that interview defending McCabe and Mrs. Miller from some early negative reviews. And it's about 10 and a half minutes. But it's really neat to see her on screen being interviewed. She's so well-spoken. And she goes after Rona Barrett and Rex Reed's negative reviews. And Rod Serling is on the show. He doesn't really say much, but he's like sitting next to her. It's interesting to see him in 1971. But so she's already saying, hey, the reviews are not great, but basically they're wrong. You should go see this movie. And I guess there were some issues with the sound mix early on, some of the early screenings. It is a muddier sound mix in some ways. I think it sounds fine on the 4K. And if you're used to Altman's audio aesthetic, you won't be shaken by it, I don't think. But it may have still been a bit novel at the time and hard for folks to grab onto, But anyway, the second Dick Cavett appearance is from August 16th, 1971, and it's Altman himself appearing on the show to discuss the movie and its reception, and those complaints about the sound mix that may have been his fault, and I don't know, about 11, almost 12 minutes of that. Beyond that, we have quite a lot of stuff. Now, I don't know how much is actually new versus the old Blu-ray. There might not be new features, but this scan is 4K digital restoration with uncompressed monaural soundtrack. I don't know. It looks good to me, and I'm very happy to have it. Again, Vilmos Zsigmond cinematography in 4K is ideal. But okay, so we have an Altman and his producer commentary from 2002, and that is producer David Foster. And Altman commentaries are interesting because they can be insightful, they can be sparse, they're kind of a crapshoot. This is the middle of the road, but the producer definitely adds some stuff to the proceedings as well. There's something called Way Out on a Limb, which is ostensibly a making of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and it's produced by Criterion in 2016. It's for that Blu-ray. It features interviews with several of Altman's longtime collaborators, the film's casting director, Graham Clifford, script supervisor, Joan Tewksbury, who would, of course, go on to write Nashville for Altman, and a filmmaker in her own right. It's great to see her in this interview. Actors Renee Auberjonois, Keith Carradine, and Michael Murphy all reflect on not just this film, but also sort of Altman in general. And it's sort of neat to hear all their recollections. Next up is something called Beauchamp and Rick Jewell, and this conversation, produced again in 2016 by the Criterion Collection, features film historians Carrie Beauchamp and Rick Jewell, and they're discussing McCabe and Mrs. Miller in the light of Altman's career and the new Hollywood and the Western genre. And right off the bat, they take issue with the idea of it being an anti-Western, as they take that to be something that completely turns the genre on its head, and they don't necessarily think this is doing that. The examples of anti-Westerns they give are like Greaser's Palace and Dead Man, and to some extent Blazing Saddles. Like, they think of this more as a revisionist Western, but it is a really neat conversation, about 36 and a half minutes. Very much enjoyed that, and I like when Criterion does those. They're kind of neat. The critic conversations, historian conversations. There's behind the scenes stuff. It's like a featurette produced on location in Canada in 1970, and it details the building of the Presbyterian Church. It's about 9.5 minutes. Leon Erickson. This is in 1999, the Art Directors Guild Film Society in Los Angeles hosted a conversation with McCabe and Mrs. Miller's production designer, Leon Erickson, led by his fellow production designer, Jack DeGovia, and the film's art director, Al Locatelli, also participated in the discussion. And it's an excerpt about the making of McCabe that's presented here, and it's based on what Erickson says here. Altman didn't give him much direction beyond, the town needing 2 saloons and a church, and kind of just let him go. And I think that was sort of Altman's MO. Some would say there's a laziness to it, but you could also argue that he's like, I hired you for just like he would say to the actors, I don't know this character better than you. You're the actor. What are you going to bring to it? And I think that is how that collaborative approach is how he got a lot of great results from not only actors, but behind the camera crew. Because I do like the production design in this movie. It really makes it feel like a real town that, I don't know, that's really part of it's rooted in that production design that the movie kind of lives. Let's see here. Vilmos Zsigmond, the late Vilmos Zsigmond, interviewed here he died in 2016, discusses his work on McCabe and Miss Miller, and combines an interview from 2005 for the American Society of Cinematographers by filmmaker and cinematographer Michael Goy, ASC, with an interview by filmmaker and cinematographer James Chrysanthus, ASC GSC conducted for his 2008 documentary No Subtitles Necessary, Laszlo and Vilmos, about Laszlo Kovacs and Vilmos Zsigmond. Talks about coming up as a DP in the American New Wave of the 1970s and his style of poetic realism, which when you think about his images, it's a perfect descriptor. Steve Shapiro is a noted photojournalist and a portrait and set photographer hired to shoot special photography, quote unquote, for McCabe. The following gallery of stills from the set was curated by the photographer himself and from his archives for this release, and you can sort of step through them with your remote. So that's it. A really nice release, and I do like the 4K upgrade. I do think it has greater detail, and yeah, I'm just a big fan of this movie, so I was very happy to get it. So that's my first little one here, and then we'll move on to something a bit older. We have The Roaring Twenties from 1939, directed by the great Raoul Walsh. And this one is pretty neat. Raoul Walsh is one of those directors that was very popular in France around the time that film noir was coined as a thing, you know, when all the American films flooded into Europe after the war, and suddenly these French film critics were evaluating a lot of American cinema and seeing some similarities and stuff like that. But I know not necessarily this film, but Raoul Walsh's films in general were very very reverent for them. And he's a great filmmaker. And this one is interesting. Weirdly, my connection to it is I most fondly remember... It's one of the most fondly remembered gangster movies in the Warner Brothers canon. And for me, I remembered as the film being watched in a theater at the climax of the film Johnny Dangerously. Where's my Blu-ray of Johnny Dangerously, by the way? Come on. So anyway... ripped from the headlines of the turbulent era between the Great War and the Great Depression, this dynamic, nostalgia-tinged crime drama balances Tommy gun action with epic historical sweep. Legends James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart star as army buddies whose fortunes rise and fall as their fates intersect, first in a foxhole on the front lines of World War I, then in Manhattan's Prohibition-era underworld, directed by Hollywood master Raoul Walsh and based on a story by prolific journalist turned screenwriter and producer Mark Hellinger. The Roaring Twenties brought to a close the celebrated Warner Brothers gangster cycle of the 1930s, and it still remains one of the greatest and most influential crime films of all time. And yeah, it's definitely a really neat one because it's, you know, in the movie, Jimmy Cagney is sort of on the downswing and Bogart's on the upswing, whereas I don't want to say it was quite the opposite in real life, but Cagney was a big star. He had been starring in films throughout the 1930s, and Bogart had as well, but he was much more almost ready to break out, you know, really. He just hadn't quite done the hits that he would be known for. He did things like Black Legion and Marked Woman in 1937, where he's getting a more prominent role. But ultimately, his big hits were yet to come. You know, he would have The Maltese Falcon in 1941. He'd also have High Sierra in 1941, which is another Raoul Walsh film. We have the Criterion Blu-ray of that. And this is I think the second Walsh film. I could be wrong. There might be another in there to be in the collection. Very happy to have High Sierra as well. That was one of his breakouts, but then of course, like I said, Maltese Falcon, Casablanca, and he's off to the races. But this is a big deal for him, Bogart that is, in terms of his career. In terms of Walsh, you know, he did High Sierra, and then there's actually another Bogart Walsh joint coming from Warner Archive that's just been announced for March, and that's They Drive by Night, sort of a trucking movie. I remember digging this one. It's been a minute. But, Walsh he'd go on to do Public Enemy with Cagney in 1949. But he also did the enjoyable comedy The Strawberry Blonde with Cagney in 1941. And that's we have the Warner Archive Blu-ray of that. I'm a big fan of his noir western, Pursued. This came out from Olive a while back. It's Robert Mitchum and Teresa Wright. Really great, literally a noir western. And I know Scorsese's a big fan of that, and his introduction is on this Blu-ray. So that's more Walsh stuff. And then lastly, for Cagney, I really like The Crowd Roars. This is a Howard Hawks film, actually, with he and Joan Blondell. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's his Days of Thunder, but it's his car racing movie before Red Line 7000. Anyway, so it's an interesting intersection, this movie. And this one has an essay by film critic Mark Ash. Of course, we have a Blu-ray and a 4K. And again, a commentary on the 4K, but most of the features will be on the Blu-ray. I'll go into those in a second. This essay is called Into the Past. The New York City of Raoul Walsh's childhood was a place where giants walked the earth and came to dinner. In his riotously unbelievable 1974 autobiography, well, I got to check that out, Each Man in His Time, that's the name of the book, the director recalls his father, Thomas Walsh, as an Irish subversive who shot his way out of Dublin, escaping on a ship bound for Spain and ending up in New York as a cutter for Brooks Brothers, where he dressed Edwin Booth for Hamlet and Teddy Roosevelt for San Juan Hill. Though his father, young Raoul, allegedly brushed up against the greats Mark Twain, Enrico Caruso, Buffalo Bill, Gentleman Jim, John L. Sullivan, some of whom would later populate his films. Yeah, in fact, Gentleman Jim is another movie that's come out from Warner Archive that Walsh did with Errol Flynn, and it's enjoyable. I just watched that this year. After his father died in 1937, Walsh writes his hometown, quote, was just another city without Big Tom. But soon enough, he would recreate the city of his memories on the New York street, quote, of the Warner Brothers back lot. That film, his first for the studio, I didn't realize that, was The Roaring Twenties, an epic spanning tall tale filled with the kind of composite characters and legendary incidents found in Walsh's recollections. The director, who had spent some of his early years as a merchant seaman and a cowboy, had been making movies since the silent era, and this project would rejuvenate his career, earning him a reputation as one of the signature action filmmakers of mid-century Hollywood. So a big deal for Walsh, too. But I think he's a really interesting filmmaker and a distinctive-looking guy. He has an eye patch, as does Fritz Lang, but he just sort of stands out as a gruff-looking dude like John Ford, who also had an eye patch. Yeah, so Roaring Twenties. What do we have on this? This is a really nice-looking 4K transfer, black and white. I do love 4K black and white, and it's a 4K digital restoration. I know that about it. And it just looks nice. These Warner Brothers movies in general, they tend to take good care of them and have good materials and do good scans. So was not disappointed with this. In terms of supplements, we have Gary Giddens, and it's an interview produced by the Criterion Collection in 2023 with film critic Gary Giddens discussing the performances in Roaring Twenties and sort of its place in the gangster genre as a whole. It's about 22 minutes. And then Raoul Walsh, there's an excerpt from an episode of the show The Men Who Made the Movies. I guess was directed by Richard Schickel, which originally aired in 1973. In it, Raoul Walsh discusses working with actors James Cagney and the famous ending of Roaring Twenties. So if you haven't seen Roaring Twenties, you may want to skip this one until you watch it. And it does sound like Sidney Pollack is narrating this segment, which is cool. I love Sidney Pollack's voice, and it sort of adds a little extra something to it. But yeah, it's neat to see Walsh talking about what you can do with certain stars and what you can't do, or what, like, again, sort of some spoilery stuff, so I don't want to get into it, but, which stars would be okay to have certain plot machinations with, and how Bogart and Cagney are a certain way, and Gable and some others are not. And it's just neat to hear him speaking about his stuff. So I dug that. And it does have an audio commentary with film historian Lincoln Hurst as well, which I was digging. And so a really nice release of Roaring Twenties on 4K from Criterion. And lastly, we have another 4K, and this is the Heroic Trio and the Executioners, a couple Johnny To films, a duology, if you will. Executioners is actually known as the Heroic Trio Part 2, I guess. I forget how the full title of it. But this is another one where it's a director that's known, Johnny To, that is, for a bit more for his films post 2000s. And I hadn't, I'm not really running necessarily in the right circles to know what is or isn't talked about enough, but I feel like I hadn't heard as much about these two films, and they definitely are fascinating films and stylized and fantastic, and you get why Johnny To has this, broader appeal to a lot of, martial arts and action film fans. So the Heroic Trio from 1993, they're both from 93, interestingly, with this outrageously entertaining cult favorite, director Johnny To and his lineup of legendary stars gave Hong Kong cinema something new, its own homegrown superhero cinematic universe, which it does. Thief Catcher, that's Maggie Cheung, Wonder Woman, Anita Mui, and Invisible Girl, Michelle Yeoh, are kick-ass crusaders who must overcome their dark pasts in order to defeat an evil baby-snatching eunuch terrorizing the city. Eye-popping motorcycle stunts, bloodthirsty undead, cannibal infants, and kinetically choreographed wirework are all part of the wall-to-wall delirium in this irresistible showcase for three of the coolest women warriors ever to hit the screen. Yeah, it is pretty special, I gotta say. I did get a chance to get a look at this one, and a nice, the elements maybe they look pretty good. I always wonder how some of these films, in terms of the elements, will be cared for, but yeah, the transfers look nice in 4K, and both the setup is basically that you get 3 discs in here. You have a 4K with the 2 films, and then separately each film gets its own Blu-ray with a few features as well. So The Executioner is the follow-up to this film in 1993. Maggie Cheung, Anita Mui, and Michelle Yeoh return in this gritty post-apocalyptic sequel to the Heroic Trio. Following a devastating nuclear attack, Hong Kong's supply of clean water has fallen into the hands of a masked maniac, Anthony Wong, intent on seizing political power, forcing the 3 fearless fighters to settle their differences and unite to stop him. Darker in tone than the original, Executioners finds Johnny To and co-director, martial arts choreographer Chin Soo Tung continuing to push their whirlwind action set pieces to new levels of cartoon craziness while adding an abundance of grungy dystopian atmosphere and a fresh dose of anti-authoritarian attitude. I'm very intrigued by this one. I definitely want to sit down and go through both of these. It's a pretty interesting entree to Johnny To's films if you haven't seen any of them. And to be honest, I haven't seen enough. I've only seen maybe 2, and I know I need to see more. Folks have let me know that I definitely have to see more of his movies, so that is something I would like to do. I think both of them have Cantonese 5.1 soundtracks and alternate English dubbed soundtracks that are mono, I think, I don't think they're stereo. The let's see, how did they arrange this? I think on the Heroic Trio Blu-ray, you have Superhero Sisterhood, and it's an interview conducted for the Criterion Collection in 2023 with the great film critic Sam Deegan, and she shares her passion for the Heroic Duology, Trio Duology, and just Johnny To in general. And it's a rare on-screen appearance for Sam Deegan if you've never seen her interviewed, so it's kind of cool to see her just on camera talking about movies. If you've heard many of her excellent commentary tracks, you know she always knows what she's talking about, and this is no exception to that. She talks about To and his influences and wuxia films and very cool stuff. Almost 18 minutes. So that's on the Heroic Trio Blu-ray. And then on the Executioners Blu-ray, there's a No Ordinary Actor, another new 2023 interview with actor Anthony Wong, candidly discussing the realities of working in the Hong Kong film industry and recalling some of his experiences on the Heroic Trio and the Executioners. It's about 7 minutes. I just want to look at, so this includes an essay by critic Beatrice Loyaza, pardon my mispronunciation. I do hate it when the essays are posters, but that's just a personal thing. Okay. So, by the 1990s, Hong Kong cinema had become beloved around the world for its restless innovation and dizzying hybridity. Few films exemplify the spirit of that era more fully than the Heroic Trio and its sequel, The Executioners, both made by director Johnny To and action choreographer Chin Su-tung, combining the mythical traditions of the wuxia genre, the grit and melodrama of the Hong Kong New Wave filmmaking of the 80s, and a dollop of loony comic book futurism. These butt-kicking fantasias are also notable as dazzling showcases of female physicality at the time when Hollywood was capitalizing on films featuring ball-busting women. Think Sigourney Weaver in Alien franchise, Linda Hamilton in the Terminator movies, to To and Ching presented girl power on a completely different and much weirder wavelength enabled by a local industry that ran on breakneck production schedules and employed intrepid stunt people who cackled in the face of insurance policies. The film's three headliners, Michelle Yeoh, Anita Mui, and Maggie Cheung, together portray a powerhouse trio like Charlie's Angels, but without any ties to a masculine authority. Here, the veteran stars, who were considered pop culture treasures long before they donned their capes, stand as emblems of Hong Kong cinema at its height. Well said. So this is definitely worth a pickup. Again, I apologize that this video, this episode is not coming out in time to make recommendations for the sale that just happened. But like I said, when the next one rolls around, these are definitely worth your time. All three of them, McCabe, and Roaring Twenties, and Heroic Trio and Executioners, all worth picking up during the next sale if you are interested in them as I've described them. So thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.